All right, we've got everyone here. So hi everyone, my name is Caitlin and I'm the Media and Communications Manager at Domestic Violence New South Wales, and I will be facilitating this event on this sunny Tuesday afternoon. I would like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we gather today, which for me is the Darawal people, and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. I also extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples here today. So welcome everyone, and thank you for coming to today's sector chat. This is an important session and we're extremely fortunate to be joined by some key organisations with voices in this area. Our guest speakers will be discussing topics such as the impact of lockdown on children, working with CALD clients, casework strategies and practical advice for services in regards to children's safety. I'd like to extend a warm welcome to our guest speakers, Janice Minogue, Senior Practitioner at Save the Children in Sydney. And also from Save the Children, we have Peter Nicol, who is Practice Development Manager in Family Functioning and Healthy Relationships. Neemat Kabutli, Acting CEO of Muslim Women Australia, and Zoe Robertson, our New South Wales Advocate for Children and Young People. We will be recording today's session and the recording will be available. We will send it out at the end of the week in our regular member comms, so keep your eyes peeled for that. And we are also going to save all of our questions till the end. So if you have any, please pop them in the chat box and who they're directed to, and we'll collect them for when our speakers have concluded. At the end, we also have a short survey we would appreciate it if you could complete. It's only 3 questions, so it's not time consuming. We'll pop the link in the chat box at the end, and it's just to give us a good idea of what you guys want to hear of in regards to sector chats moving forward and how helpful you find these sessions. Right, so let's get started. I would like to welcome Janice Minogue and Peter Nicol from Save the Children.
Thanks, Caitlin. I would just share presentation.
Hi, everybody.
Sorry. And 1 second. All right. So I would just like to add my welcome and acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands from which we're both meeting today. I'm sitting in the coastal area of Maroubra, and this is the home of the Bidjigal and Gadigal peoples of the Eora Nation.
And I'm joining you from Bundaberg, up near Bundaberg this afternoon in Queensland. So I'm on the lands of the Kabi Kabi and Gubbi Gubbi people. Just to give you a little bit of an idea of who we are, I'm not going to read that entire screen, but I've been at Save the Children for about 20 years now. So I'm currently in a practice development manager role, working with our programs that have got a focus on family support work and domestic violence work, and, you know, with a central theme of keeping children safe. And Janice?
Thanks, Peter. So I'm working, well, I have the privilege of working with family and domestic violence services through our Everyday Positive Play program, so just providing coaching and support around embedding child-centered and trauma-informed approaches in the ways that they work.
Thanks, Janice. Janice is going to drive this presentation for us this afternoon, so hopefully we don't get mixed up with our screens, but we're going really well so far, Janice, I think. To give you an idea of what we're going to cover this afternoon, we've just put a little bit of an agenda up. So you can see that we're going to talk a little bit about the impacts of domestic violence on children, and then the impacts of COVID restrictions on children and young people. We want to talk with you a little bit about child-centered trauma-informed approaches in the work that we do, and some strategies that we have and that our teams use around supporting felt safety through Dr. Bruce Perry's work around regulating, relating and reasoning. Thanks, Janice.
Thanks, Peter.
So, and, you know, I think hopefully a lot of what we talk about this afternoon will resonate with you, and there will be some, you know, some bits that you go, oh, that's great. I didn't know that, but we've got some resources on a final slide to share with you. So if there's more information that you're looking for around any of the things that we talk about, chances are it'll be there, but you can always reach out to Janice or myself, and we'll help you out as best we can. So we all know that in any work we do with children, we need to ensure that we consider the whole child and their life world and how they may be impacted by their experiences as we seek to support them. So to contextualise the current experience of lockdown on the children and young people we work with in the DV space, we also need to be cognizant of the impacts of domestic violence on them. Research shows that children of all ages, including the child in utero and infants, are impacted by domestic and family violence. And it's the whole child that can be impacted in their psychological, social, emotional, physical and cognitive well-being and functioning, as well as in their behaviour and development. We all know that what this looks like will be unique to the child or young person. So amongst other factors, the child's temperament, their stage of development, their perception of events, their quality and availability of their attachment relationships, and any additional circumstances and support networks that they have will have varying influence on how domestic and family violence impacts them. As we think about the impacts of domestic violence on the child, a key consideration is the impact on the child's attachment relationship with their primary caregiver as significant to their well-being and to their development. For the child, the biggest protective factor to buffer the impact of traumatic experiences such as domestic and family violence is having at least one attuned, consistent and caring caregiver. Any rupture in this primary attachment relationship will negatively impact on the child. And our relationships with peers are also increasingly significant in the life world of the older child or young person. Impacts of domestic and family violence on the child's experience of schooling and their peer relationships, and any impacts on the continuity of these due to the need to move away from the violence also need to be considered.
So in the same way that we see differential impacts of domestic and family violence on the child being influenced by their individual characteristics and circumstances, we also understand that the impact of domestic and family violence on the individual child will be an influencing factor in how they experience this current context of COVID restrictions and the impacts of the lockdown. Research from prior lockdowns regarding the impacts on children and young people as a cohort can provide some indication of what current experiences may include, while it's also important to consider any new accumulative and differential impacts experienced within the current context. So research on both the short and long-term impacts is still to evolve with the unfolding situation. However, we do know that there have been numerous changes to the life worlds of the child, which can impact on their usual support networks, their coping strategies, and other protective or risk factors around them. We also understand that the impacts of COVID measures as experienced by the child's caregiver can impact on the home environment and the parent-child relationship. Disruptions to caregiver routines, increased caregiving responsibilities, and additional stresses can impact on parent-caregiver well-being and their capacity to be attuned and responsive to their child. The Australian Institute for Health and Welfare reported that several risk factors for child abuse and neglect increased during COVID-19 in 2020. This included financial hardship, housing stress, and poor mental health. In regards to the mental health of children and young people, Kids Helpline also experienced a 24% increase in contacts between March and July last year. In addition, we see from an Australian Human Rights Commission report that looked at data from Kids Helpline inputs during the period of January to the end of April 2020, the top 5 concerns related to COVID-19 raised by all children and young people were mental health resulting from COVID-19, social isolation, education impacts, impacts on family life, and changes to plans and usual activities. UNICEF also conducted a series of 3 separate national consultations with children and young people at different times last year and into January of this year that really capture the reflections on the felt impacts of COVID measures on their lives and their well-being. particularly during lockdown periods, as well as the times where these measures eased. The highest areas of negative impact that they reported included having to stop seeing their friends, disruptions to schooling, stopping the usual extracurricular activities, and parents or carers losing part or all of their income. Their self-reported ability to cope was also notably lower during the first national lockdown periods than prior to COVID. And although children and young people have showed a lot of resilience and as their ability to cope increased again after lockdown measures, these levels were still somewhat lower at the end of 2020 than at the beginning of last year. We also know, and many of you will be very familiar with this from previous lockdown experiences, that domestic and family violence does increase at this time. This was seen last year across New South Wales, Victoria and Queensland, with a reported increase in client numbers, frequency and severity of violence. There was also an increased complexity in client needs with greater hardship, particularly financial and housing insecurity, which correlated with their increased stress levels and increased domestic violence. Currently, our staff who are supporting carers, caregivers in refuge have reported that clients are sharing experiences of compounded stress due to changes to their routines and apprehensions about taking their children outside, the limited social engagement that they're experiencing and the impacts on their children's behaviour. They're also reporting additional complexity in their needs, such as housing, visas, and courts attendance issues. So taking all this into consideration, how can we best support a child's safety and wellbeing at this time? The supports that we provide the child will be better targeted and more effective when we work from a child-centered and trauma-informed approach. This approach informs our practice to really consider the child holistically, their intersecting life worlds, and the potential impact of trauma on them as individuals. Our application of this approach will lead us to not only assess and support what we may see as the real safety needs of the child, but to also support them to experience that deeper level of felt safety as individual to them. It guides our practice in recognising the individual child, including their strengths and resources, and respecting their stage of development, whilst ensuring we appropriately provide opportunity for their participation and voice to inform how we work with them, and for them to engage in all decisions that impact them.
Developmental trauma research clearly shows us that the efforts to support the child to repair from the impact of trauma, connect in relationships that may be in need of repair, and to experience healthy development will be compromised in the absence of felt safety. We understand that many of you will be familiar with Dr. Bruce Perry's 3Rs model that follows the sequence of brain development and guides us to meet the child where they're positioned in their brain at the time so that we can effectively support them. The impact of trauma on the child can mean that their attention and energy is frequently being diverted to the lower region or the survival area of their brain because they don't feel safe or because they're activated by trauma into their fight, flight, or freeze responses. This then means that the brain is left with limited resources to access higher relating and thinking processes. Therefore, if a child does not feel safe and is positioned in their lower or survival brain, then we need to support the child to regulate or calm their brain and body before we can expect them to relate effectively and before we can expect them to reason. We need to remember the order: regulate, relate, then reason. Part of the base of our work with the child is supporting their felt safety needs and supporting their primary caregiver to understand the child's need for felt safety in the context of their experience of domestic and family violence and potential impacts of trauma. And I guess when we talk about felt safety, we're talking about the deliberate arrangement of the environment and the adjusting of our behaviour that we do so that we know that a child can feel truly safe in that environment and with you. So regulating the lower brain is one of the easiest things that we can do. It's best supported by breath as well as through movement. So for example, the calming effect of gentle repetitive rocking for an infant, and other appropriate sensory inputs and relational safety. There's lots of different sensory inputs and tools that you can use to support your work with the child, as we've got demonstrated here, and that you can make available to them. So in your casework, you can explore with the individual child or young person their preferred sensory inputs that support them. Consider environments from a child or young person's perspective to assess how they support felt safety and calm. This includes in your service, in the child's home, and as they transition into new environments. Invite the child's input where you can facilitate this, and work with the parent or caregivers to make appropriate changes that will support the child's sensory and developmental needs and interests. Even if this isn't the whole home environment, it can be the child's room or a place specifically designed for that child, which can make a big difference for the child's sense of calm.
So from the very outset of beginning to work with a family, there's opportunity to support a child's sense of relational safety with you, and for you to also model ways for the family to be with the child that are respectful and warm and supports their development. So this can include providing developmentally appropriate play opportunities for the child, being consistent with boundaries, and with creating routine and rituals to your casework meetings. These support the child's sense of safety and control as they know what to expect and how to engage with you. In your work with a parent or caregiver, you can also support the parent or caregiver's understanding of the child's experience and the impact of trauma on them. The parent's understandings of child development and behaviour and their role in building their child's brain. We can also encourage and model a position of curiosity that asks what the child's behaviour is telling us about their level of felt safety and what underlying need it points to so that we can support the child there. In your work with the family, you also have the opportunity to be modelling and creating opportunities for the parent and child to play together. And I can't underestimate or overestimate, I should say, how significant this can be for a child to have play, and for a parent and child to rediscover what play means where that's been impacted by the experience of domestic and family violence. Even during adapted service delivery due to lockdown measures, there are really creative ways that we can support these interactions. For example, some of our staff that support children and parents in refuge have supplied parents with activity packs that have play ideas and resources that they can do with their children. And many of these parents have shared how this has been a real practical support for them at this time, and supported them to engage positively with their child. Providing space for caregivers like this to practice how to be with the child includes bringing both those elements of warmth and structure into the relationship. So supporting parents to understand, the importance of warmth, having that play, having fun together, smiling, having that, safe touch, the hugs, and then also providing structure, such as boundaries, routine, and responsibilities, as they support a child's sense of safety. Caseworkers can encourage parents to be really intentional about routines and rituals as a way of supporting the child in knowing what to expect and being able to exercise choice and control, and explain to parents how these can also support memory making and relationship building through the experience of these rituals together. The whole thing of just having a simple pizza night or a bedtime story really can build trust in a relationship, and having that consistency, creating that sense of safety. Particularly during this time of disruption to normal routines, we can support both the child and the caregiver to develop new routines to support stability and their wellbeing. So supporting the parent-child relationship also looks like recognising and building on the parenting relationship with the child, their parenting skills, building on recognising what they're doing really well and encouraging them in that. Supporting parents to understand as well any learning difficulties or developmental delays that the child's experiencing, so that they can be appropriately supported and understood. and address these.
Thanks, Janice. So we've got some questions that we encourage our teams to use in a reflective practice capacity to help us consistently apply that child-centred, trauma-informed approach to our work. So we recognise that the child may be impacted by trauma. So some of the questions that we ask: how can I help create felt safety? In the current context, are there additional stresses for the child that may add to the impacts of trauma on them or create new traumas? What are the strategies and supports that we may need to work in or to introduce to support them at this time to support felt safety? We know that the child is developing. How can I respect the unique stage of development they're in as I work with the child and young person and their family? Are the information and supports developmentally appropriate? Are the expectations and the opportunities relevant to their stage of development? How do I help parents understand that stage of development? We know that the child's an individual, so how can I relate with them and support them? How can I affirm their strengths and their capacities? We know that the child has a right to be heard. How can I invite their participation and voice? How can I create safe spaces and ways for them to share their concerns, thoughts, ideas, views, and interests? And how can I ensure their voice is considered in all decisions that impact on them? And we know that the child's family, kinship, or a community. And how might I need to support the parent and child to reconnect or rebuild or repair their relationship if that's needed? The child might have been disconnected from important relationships in their family or their kinship network or community due to the domestic violence, and further due to the COVID restrictions. So how can they be supported to navigate this, to stay connected where appropriate with social supports, and to establish new relational networks where needed?
So we're going to end there, but just to, we really wanted to provide you with some links to some different resources that could support you, you know, in your practice and finding tools that you can apply with the child. So a lot of these sites provide really great information and yeah, tools that you can use. And Dr. Wendy Bunston, I'll just highlight, has, you know, really brought focus on the child and the infant within the domestic and family violence space. And she's got some great books if you want to read up more around that. And also, as I mentioned, I am involved in a program, Everyday Positive Play, which Save the Children offers. If that's something that you're interested in, there's a link to that there too. Thanks, Caitlin.
Thank you, Janice and Peter. That was great. Also, just letting everyone know, we will be sharing those slides and we will send them around when we send around the recording as well. So those resources will be available to you. I would like to invite Nimat now to speak. Thank you, Nimat.
Caitlin, I'm just going to quickly share my screen, if that's okay.
Go for it.
Okay, can you see that?
Yes.
Okay, excellent. Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us on this lovely Tuesday afternoon. My name is Nimat Kabutli. I'm the acting CEO of Muslim Women Australia, and we provide the Linking Hearts Multicultural Family Violence and Homelessness Service. I'd also like to pay my respects to Aboriginal people and acknowledge country, and I'm coming to you from Darug country today. Today, I guess I'll speak to you about the work MWA does to keep children in view from both a service delivery perspective, but as well from a community development perspective. So the service delivery perspective will very much be specific to a domestic family violence and homelessness context, and the community development perspective looking at our work more broadly with young people, with mothers and with seniors, and how that intersects within multicultural or culturally and linguistically diverse communities. Of course, these don't exist separately. They often, the community development programs often act as a soft entry point to specialist service delivery and vice versa. In the specialist service delivery context, a lot of the time the extended youth and community development and mothers programs act as a wraparound support pathway for the communities that we support. Today, I'm really here representing our caseworkers, our bicultural, our multilingual and multi-faith team, who are really doing some amazing work with children and young people, particularly in this lockdown at the moment, and we operate predominantly in the Southwest Sydney district. I was hoping that they would be here to speak on for themselves today, but we really, with the volume of referrals that we've been getting, we can't spare them. And I think that just needs to be acknowledged that, it's really coming from a practice-led perspective today. Linking Hearts delivers holistic support options focused on prevention, early intervention, safe and supported accommodation, as well as rapid rehousing and supports for clients with complex needs. And that includes individual and family-based responses. So our our case management is provided for individualized case management for women, as well as individualized case management for children. This is really important in working with multicultural communities because it's important to understand the role of caring structures and extended family caring structures in an individual setting, but also within a family-based context. For many women, her healing will be very much dependent on her capacity to parent and to support the needs of her child. And often it is through empowering her children that a mother also regains her strength within herself. And this is very much reflected in work around resilience and resistance-based practice in domestic and family violence contexts. Keeping a child in view can also apply when they don't appear to be in the picture. This is particularly important in supporting victim survivors of elderly abuse. We need to consider things like, do they care for grandchildren? Are there any other family or caring responsibilities that come into the picture? And how can that be leveraged to improve her psychosocial well-being, especially in contexts of isolation and fear? As part of our COVID response at MWA, there has been a real focus on children more than ever before. And I guess the traditional role as the caseworker, as we know it, no longer exists in this environment. Caseworkers have had to step into mothering, mentoring, and teaching roles like they haven't done before. And the ways that we've been trying to do that and to foster that environment is to incorporate a few frameworks that we utilize at the moment. We have our caseworkers checking in daily with the family as a whole, and often sometimes twice a day with children individually being case managed and identified if they need that extra support. And so that includes check-ins in the morning as a family, checking in the afternoon with children, and of course there's a huge range of ages that we support. And so there's different mechanisms and strategies that we have in play according to the ages and needs of the children. As a family, we're really talking about issues around mental health. There is, especially in Southwest Sydney in the last few weeks, a lot of miscommunication around testing, around vaccines, around COVID, isolation, education, anxiety. So we've been acknowledging that as a family unit and then identifying individual responses according to the needs of the children and the families that we're working with. We've been doing a lot to stimulate and encourage children and family-based play. We've been sending out games, toys, activity packs. As you know, within family violence settings, a lot of the time it's very much a crisis, and they don't leave if they're entering into crisis or refuge settings with very much. So that's being supported whether they're in crisis accommodation or at any stage of support through the transitional housing processes that we have. We're also supporting with homeschooling, and this is important from both perspectives because we're identifying any shortages in from an education perspective, but also any shortages in digital technology or resourcing for parents and children. And then at the same time, making sure that we work with families to make sure that the time that's allocated to support with homeschooling as well is also supporting parents, because it's often the only break that they're getting to do other things. So we're trying to make sure that it's quite strategic in the way that we offer that support. We're also facilitating activities online. So things like drawing and colouring, playing Scrabble, sharing links to resources, whether it's ABC sites that they have activities at the moment. And then depending on the age groups, whether it's from preschoolers to teenager, we're also doing virtual visits with the children and providing HSC support to senior high school age children. Like I mentioned, we're also checking on for the digital needs, but also making sure that all of our clients have Telstra mobile top-ups at all times so that they have direct access to caseworkers, not just from the parents, but also for children with access to phones and technology as well. In our refuge at the moment, which we call our guest homes, all of the children that we're supporting are under 5 years old. And so we've got specific, preschool age programs and activities that are specific to all of our families that are in crisis refuge accommodation. I wanted to share the slides with you today because I just wanted to show you some of the cases that we've been supporting, and these are specific cases for within the last fortnight. And so I just wanted to share some different scenarios which require keeping children in view from a different lens. So I'll quickly move on, see if I can move this. Okay, so we've got we had a case that was referred via DVRE. It was on a weekend call, and we were able to bring her into the refuge. This client experienced severe domestic and family violence and abuse, and the child was actually locked up in a cage by his father. She fled with no clothes, no food, no income. She comes from a Vietnamese background, and she has a language barrier, no income. She didn't know how to go to the shops to support herself. And when she escaped, she left with only one pair of pants for her son, no shoes, and only socks. We're working with DCJ as well to support the child and improve his well-being. And I just wanted to show you this beautiful photo that she shared with us, which is when all of these clothes were delivered to her child. And I can't tell you how many times she said thank you, and the notable improvement in her son's behavior and the impact that that's had on her ability to then actually take the steps that she needs to also build her own capacity and make informed choices for herself has made an overwhelming difference. This photo here is a beautiful drawing of a little girl with her caseworker. So she's got they're connected there by the heart in the middle. And the client that we're supporting, whose 8-year-old drew this photo, she experienced violence and has complex mental health and alcohol and other drug abuse as well, misuse. And this child is actually not her child, it's her cousin's daughter. But her mother died when she was young, and so she cares for her part-time. So she's so aware of MWA and the role that MWA plays in supporting her auntie. And she is very connected to the caseworker as well. And I just wanted to show this because we also make an effort to include, even if it's not their direct child, if they're in their care, even part-time, even sometimes we make a conscious effort to make sure that that child is included in activities, in games, in brokerage support, and it makes a huge impact to the feeling of safety for both the client and for those in her care. I guess then I'll be moving on a little bit to a homelessness context now, and I just wanted to show the impact of why we need to not just work within a bubble and work really to ensure qualified, dignified outcomes for families and children. This father, he's a single father with 3 young girls, and they lost their mother due to cancer a couple of months ago. The father, because of COVID, was facing extreme hardship, and he's had to stop work to look after them. And really, it's these beautiful girls who look after him. And so we provided virtual barbecue packs to our families in the thick of lockdown to bring some dignity and care and support and life into their homes. And these are these beautiful girls, accessing meat, which they haven't had a chance to access because it's not cheap. It's very expensive, and we take these for granted sometimes. And so that's just another story of, yes, it's important to work with women and children, but sometimes women aren't in the picture. There are a lot of variables and a lot of factors to how we can still support children without their mother being present. And another issue, another man that we're supporting is a Samoan man with 5 children under the age of 10. And what does that look like, that support in parenting and accessing education, children needs there. And I'll just move on a little bit just to speak about what we can do from a community development perspective more broadly for those who might not work specifically in a domestic violence or service delivery context. And we're working really closely with our youth groups, and particularly our mothers and seniors group. We've established a youth advisory committee who are really working hard to foster this youth strategy, because we know about the mental health impacts that young people are experiencing, particularly young people that are in high school, has been overwhelming at the moment. So these are some of the gifts and activities that we sent them. Some were Eid gifts for young people. We've also had psychologists join on several sessions to support the stress, mindfulness, needs of young people, and explore what's going on at the moment with personal and familial cohesion, because families are under stress in ways that they've never been before. And what we've created is sort of chill sessions where kids, you know, in high school are having to be online for very instructive environments like schooling or extracurricular activities. And so these chill sessions that we've created are really peer-to-peer support programs where they can just be, and then we bring in psychologists and other experts to really support their wellbeing and development. So that's just a little bit of what we're doing at MWA in supporting families and supporting children. I think we need to be creative, and we need to really make sure that any support that we provide is keeping children in view, even where they may not be in our view, and being really mindful about the improvements to psychosocial wellbeing, to safety and cultural safety that's included in that. And this is just a beautiful message that was shared with us yesterday that you can see there. And it's really about that quality service delivery at the moment. So thank you for listening, and I really welcome any questions that you might have later on. Thanks.
Thank you, Nima, for that incredible perspective. That was amazing. Next, I would like to welcome Zoe Robinson, who's the New South Wales Advocate for Children and Young People. If you have any questions for Nima, pop them in the chat and we will hold them at the end when Zoe is finished. Thank you, Zoe.
Thanks, Caitlin, and thank you, Nima and Peter and Janice as well before. I too would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands that we're all on today. I'm on Gadigal land and pay my respect to elders past, present and emerging, and leaders amongst us here as well. I also want to take a moment, for those who don't understand or know what my position is, I sit as an independent statutory officer in government, but obviously independent of government. So I want to take a moment to acknowledge the frontline workers and the people who are continuing to support children during this time, and the work that you and your agencies and your staff and everyone is doing. So I want to take the opportunity to thank you for that work and the ongoing work that you continue to provide. Just in terms of, I guess, the perspective that we bring to this as a different kind of perspective, I suppose, is our role is to bring the voice of children and young people into government. And we say government, business and community because we work broadly across the sector. And so the key thing for us is to speak to children and young people regularly about the things that impact on their lives. And so we want to understand what children have to say, what children want, and then what does this actually mean in terms of a policy response or a government response or a business response. So one thing I want to start off by saying is that the topic that we're talking about, whilst it is focused on COVID, when we're talking about violence and children and young people, it is something that even before COVID, I would hazard to guess we weren't necessarily getting it right at all. And that's not a reflection on services. It's more to say that potentially from a policy perspective and how we were thinking about children and young people in this space, it wasn't something, there was still work being done. And then we went into a COVID world, and now we've had to obviously figure out how we continue to support children and young people when we don't have the things that we usually rely on, such as mandatory reporters and teachers and all of the things that are constantly supporting our children and young people. And to that end, I want to acknowledge the incredible piece of work that was done by the previous advocate around the End Violence campaign, End Violence Against Children and Young People, the Forever and Now campaign. And that was a big piece of work, and I'm happy to obviously share it after this meeting in terms of talking to children and young people about violence, but also about, you know, kind of the way community also responds to that. And so just to give you a stat that came out of that piece of work, it was that on average, people think that about 1 in 5 cases of children reporting abuse are not true. And that is, I think, incredibly upsetting, because when we're talking about those 1 in 5, the people who think that, we're talking about those who children and young people are trusting and sharing their voice with, and that there has been some decision made or some choice that's made that says that we haven't believed those children. So I think if we're thinking about the world that we were in pre-COVID and the world that we're in now, I did want us to reflect back on the fact that there is some stats that beforehand say that, you know, there's a lot of work to be done. And I think in terms of that reporting and our role as an office and our role in terms of working with children and young people is that what they are telling us is their truth, and it is not our role to question that truth. When they are sharing with us, when they are telling us the things that matter to them, the way that they are sharing that so openly with us, and that is their truth. And so, as you could probably appreciate, sometimes in government we might run into a few hurdles when people want to question truth, but our position is that when children and young people are working with us and talking to us, it is what they say, and that's what we report back to them. In terms of the world that we're currently in, I'd want to acknowledge that we did, every agency and every service on this call and everyone who works in this space has had to, as Nemat herself said, has had to be creative and thoughtful in how we have dealt with the situation that we're in. And so I want to acknowledge that whilst when we're talking about child protection and we're talking about violence, there has been some amazingly innovative pieces of work that have happened during this time. So I know of services, and I'm sure that you know of them too, that as an example, have installed certain, so this is certainly a regional community, have installed a intercom on the front of the service. And so all the young people were given, knew that was there. And if they came, because it had a camera on it, if they came in there and pressed 111, the camera would obviously go to the service providers and they would understand that that child needed a welfare check. So they gave information and shared directly with children and young people. And I think, as everyone has spoken about in here, children and young people are the individual. They might be part of a family unit, they might be part of a wider group, but treating them as the individual and the needs that they need and asking them about the things that they need in a situation is so incredibly important, but also responding in a way that means that there is ways that we engage them. And I'm sure you all heard about or read about those that in communities who led Instagram challenges or things like that to keep their children and young people engaged. But I also know that some of the undertone on that was if children weren't participating, then it gave a service an opportunity to go and see or conduct a welfare check. Right now, I know there is a balance in terms of the anxiety and stress that is being faced by those in the communities of particular interest in lockdown, in terms of the balancing of making sure that people are staying at home, but also how are we ensuring the safety of children and young people and what that looks like. Some of the work that we've been doing that might be of interest, and again, happy to share if people are interested in it, is that last year, throughout the entirety of COVID, we did fortnightly polling with children and young people to understand what their concerns were. That information was fed up to the Premier's office and the cabinet who was dealing with things around this, and it continues this year as well. So what I would say is that there is a very clear interest and a very clear need in understanding what that is. And as you would all appreciate, children and young people often talk about their families and their families' needs at this time, and their concerns being around how they can support their families, what happens. And we all know that when a family is under stress is when we can start to see some cracks and see things come in. So we've heard a lot about financial stress, but as Nemat also referred to as the food shortages and stresses that's on families. So we've been working very closely with 106 children and young people who we've sent surveys out to on Fridays to ask for their sentiment. We've done wider polling around that, and we are supporting Multicultural New South Wales in terms of contacting schools and children and young people directly. And overwhelmingly, we hear obviously the need for clarity of message, their concerns around mental health, and their concerns around their community and how they can support their community. And the last thing I will want to say is, as we all know, the things that are happening in this COVID world will not stop simply because we come out of COVID. There will be long-term need to support children and young people, and to continue to invest in the things that they are saying that they need, be it mental health support, be it peer-to-peer support, be it the ability to support their families, but also the access to clear information and clear needs. So I think I applaud all of the people who spoke before and all of your services for putting children and young people as individuals and at the centre of all of your work, because it's so important. And all I wanted to say is, I know you were doing great work before, you're doing excellent work during COVID as well. But I think, as we all know, there will still be work to be done post-COVID, and we should all continue to support each other, share that information, and really build a foundation that means that no child or young person faces violence in their life ever, not just in a pandemic as well.
Thank you, Zoe. That was great. And absolutely, I mean, we all know that these issues are not new issues. They've just simply been exacerbated by COVID. So moving on to a couple of questions. If you have any questions, please pop them in the chat box. The first one is, does anybody have any advice or suggestions on increasing access to internet in particular? Are there programs people have come across to assist with providing dongles, etc.?
I mean, I've spent a best part of my last 3 weeks trying to source devices for actually young people in justice and leaving justice. I think there is no perfect remedy around this right now. I think it is asking a lot of people in a variety of places. I know last year there was a centralised effort from the Chief Information Officer and Chief Technology Officers to try and provide that. So the short answer is I think a lot of it is from the goodwill of those around you and people that you know. I know that there is still work going on around the data collection and being able to share unused data with services. So I'm happy to take part of that on notice if it's helpful and see whether I can ascertain what's going on from a government perspective. But I know that a lot of services have just relied on the kindness of services in their area, or like I said, some have asked me to try and source things, and I'm not sure why I have that, but I think it's probably from the private sector that's been helping out a bit around this as well.
I'll add to that as well. Not so much in terms of internet service provision, but we have had, from our experience, more requests for access for more resources themselves. So we'll have, like, larger household groupings and things like that. And I know that working with local schools that the children, usually connect with, or anything, they actually have been a lot more responsive and a lot more helpful this time around. March last year, it was an absolute shamble. So I think there is a bit more of a concerted effort to improve that. But as Zoe mentioned, it's very ad hoc. So it's worth reaching out to any of the networks where you're based and seeing if there's any support there.
Thank you, Nemat. I hope that helped. And I have another question for you, Nemat. Can we refer clients from Northern Sydney area to Linking Hearts?
So Linking Hearts predominantly is based in Sydney District and Southwest Sydney District. But if we have vacancies and the referral comes through, then we will definitely support that person. We have a no wrong door approach, and we absolutely implement that. So it's good to know, the eligibility sort of framework that we operate in, but we often support beyond our service scope and also non-citizens as well, to the best of our ability.
Thank you.
Sorry, I was going to mention, I did put the number in the chat, so it's there for referrals. We also take any referrals from Link to Home, 1-800-RESPECT, and self-referrals as well.
And we will ensure that we put send details around when we send around the slides and send around the recording of this session. Any further questions? I might fill the gap with one of my own, actually. I would like to ask, especially aimed at Janice and Peter, DVNSW is a peak body and not a frontline service, and there may be some services out there that don't predominantly work with children and young people. So what can we do as non-frontline services to make sure that, what's the minimum that we can do to ensure that this priority is still front and foremost of the state's mind?
Janice, I'm going to leave that one for you, seeing as that's a very much everyday positive play question, hey?
Thanks, Peter. Yeah, so I guess it's, well, in terms of everyday positive play, like the whole focus is basically bringing, that the idea of the child in the forefront of the mind of people who are working in that space, whether it's with just the caregiver or with the parent and the child, but also in advocacy work. So yeah, just elevating the needs of the child, and that the child is uniquely impacted by domestic and family violence, and it's also a prime space and opportunity to change the trajectory that the impact of domestic and family violence can have on the child by intervening early and supporting them from that place, and supporting the parent in their parenting, and to bring repair where there's been any damage because of their experience. Yeah, am I speaking to the question?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you, Janice.
Caitlin, can I add as well? I think it's really important, from the advocacy perspective and that peak role that DV New South Wales plays, particularly in advocating for, the centering of children and the impacts of of domestic and family violence, that we also frame that conversation from very much a healing and empowerment perspective, because we know for multicultural communities or for First Nations communities, sometimes that intervention and that intersection in the sort of in the child protection space can actually also be harmful. So we just need to make sure that we really provide a really nuanced and measured perspective that supports healing in the long and safety in the long term.
Absolutely. Thank you, Nina. And have another question here about Linking Hearts. Are there accommodation services available to women on temporary visas?
Sorry, trying to find the unmute button. Yes, so MWA has always supported women on temporary visas. I know that SHS services aren't specifically funded to do that, but we've always worked in that environment. It's very specific to the work that we do. Right now in the COVID-19 context, there's a range of issues for women on temporary visas. Some of that is accessing emergency accommodation, which we've all been working really closely with DCJ to provide. And some of it is very much related to homelessness issues and financial risks. So please don't hesitate to send through any referrals. If we can support them, we absolutely will, depending on our intake and assessment processes, and also connect with other service providers in the space like RACS, IARC, Red Cross, Oz Harvest, a whole range of providers, really just depending on what the needs are. But of course, the systemic and the structural barriers that exist for women and children on temporary visas, the intersection of migration status and what that means in terms of accessing support, the insecurity and the anxiety that it can place on families and children who understand what that might mean. It's not something that is lost on us. So please, definitely, if you feel that we can be of support, don't hesitate to refer, and we'll make sure that they're linked in appropriately according to their needs.
Thank you, Nina. And we will send around a follow-up to this session with all the details. And a question, I know it's hard to be keeping up with intervention need at the moment, but what prevention work is happening behind the scenes or being set up for the ongoing repercussions from the pandemic? I believe that was an open question, so if anybody wanted to have a stab.
And I mean, I know that services and peak bodies and all that will be leading the charge in terms of that, and perhaps in terms of answering your first question, Caitlin, that's something that I think has a great role for peak bodies, because services are so focused on the now, and how do you have a role to help with that roadmap? Look, I guess from the insights that I can share that we have from our work and supporting government is there is a big focus on obviously the current situation that we're in, but there is a very key group of people who are working on the roadmap out of that, and one of those is obviously a pillar that is focused on children and young people culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds, obviously our Aboriginal colleagues as well. And so look, I think that there is a lot of focus on the now, but there is a very clear understanding that the impacts, and we have data that we had previously from the last COVID kind of bigger lockdowns where we understand the impact of that. And so there is regularly run reports and all of that kind of stuff that talks about risk of significant harm and reporting and all of that. So I think from a government perspective, I wouldn't say that it would be stuff that you're feeling right now in terms of the actual implementing it, but there is certainly a lot of work going on. I know that very clear next question might be from that, and I understand this, having been in a peak body world as well, is that Surely the sector should be engaged in that work. Yes, of course. And I don't think that there's no intention not to do that. I think that there is some things that, as you can all appreciate, that we have to line up in the background to make sure that we can do that engagement well and efficiently with services who are already stretched to capacity.
Thanks, sir. I'll add to that as well, that I think that it's really good to see across the peaks that there is some forward thinking going and an investment in, moving post lockdown and what that, what that underinvestment in these spaces has looked like for quite a significant number of years, and what we need to do to address the immediate needs as well as the medium term needs, because we all know that while services are at capacity now, the increase, particularly in domestic violence volumes, will most likely mirror the easing of restrictions. And so that's something that we need to plan for, I think, as a sector. But I think there is scope within service provision now to utilise the existing networks and the existing client bases that you have to do some of that preventative work yourself, and some of those examples around building capacity of young people to share their voice, setting up, youth advisory groups, even support groups in clients, depending on where they're at in their healing journey. But I think that be creative, and don't think we need to wait for out of lockdown to do that. We can start, planting those seeds now and waiting for them to sprout and come to fruition down the track. So great question about looking forward.
Absolutely. Thank you, Nemat. And I agree with your sentiment, Zoe, is that it is a big role for peak bodies. And I know that DVNSW has primary prevention and early intervention at the front and foremost of our advocacy. So that's definitely something we'll take to heart moving forwards. We have time for a couple more if anybody had any further questions. If not, Pip has posted the survey link in the chat box. It would be great. It's only a couple of questions. It'd be really great if you could take the time to fill it out, just so we know that you guys are getting the most out of these sessions as you can. All right, if there are no more questions, I think that wraps it up. So thank you so much for our guest speakers for joining us today. There's no greater time to ensure we're across the needs of children and young people who experience domestic and family violence during COVID. So it's much appreciated, and your perspectives are very much appreciated and valued. So we will be following this session up, and we will be posting around the recording as well as Save the Children's slides and any further details. So keep your eyes out for that. So if you have any questions, Pip's put her email in. So thank you all for joining us today, and have a great afternoon.